That wasn't very much of an introduction. For a person of my importance, however, I've learned through my broad experience as a public speaker to expect this kind of thing, and so I've come prepared with an introduction. Which I feel will come a good deal closer to doing me justice, and so I'll use it at this time. Our speaker today is a man of wide reputation, and although his name is well known to all who are gathered here, it might be well to review for you his background since his rise to his present high position from the humblest of beginnings is a stirring tribute to the fact that this land of ours is truly the land of opportunity. Dwight Alvin Nesmith was born in Teachai, Kansas, just a few short years ago, where his father was Methodist minister. If you can think of any humbler beginnings than that, I'll put in with you. The little parsonage where this momentous event took place still stands today, close by the bustle and noise of Wichita, just 80 miles due south of the boyhood home of Dwight Eisenhower at Abilene. Dwight Alvin was one of 5 children, and his early years were happy ones, filled with friendly competition with his brothers and sisters at the dinner table for food. The fact that he has 2 brothers, each of whom weigh in excess of 200 pounds, is sufficient evidence as to how these battles usually ended. In the years before the war, our honored guest studied accounting and worked in such important positions as grocery clerk at the A&P, office boy for the Cudahy Packing Company, and bookkeeping clerk at a Bible bookstore. By skimping and saving and burning cut-rate gas in his convertible, he worked his way through 1.5 years of business school before his country called him to duty. They called and they called. And finally, 10 months after Pearl Harbor, he went. He enlisted in the United States Air Force, and due to the fact that even flight surgeons have a sense of humor, he qualified for flight training. His physique was officially described as 135 pounds of bone and muscle plus 2 pounds of fighting heart. He received his pilot's wings and his commission, being declared an officer and a gentleman by act of Congress, which was merely the recognition by a group of politicians of a fact previously established by nature. He served in the Pacific as the pilot of a B-24, and because of his strict adherence to the principles set forth in the motto of the 431st Bombardment Squadron, quote, "He who fights and runs away will live to fight another day," end quote, he attained the rank of squadron coward. Shortly after his return to the United States, the war ended in spite of the fact that in those days we had France, China, and the United States Navy on our side. After his discharge in 1945, he enrolled at Northwestern University in mechanical engineering and graduated in the fall of 1948 and came to Kansas State as an instructor. His prime reason for accepting the position was his desire to do missionary work among the natives in his home state. He instructed for 3 years in mechanical engineering, bringing pleasure and satisfaction to hundreds of students through his scintillating presentation of such fascinating courses as thermodynamics, heat power, and steam and gas engineering. For the past 10 years, he's been employed in the Engineering Experiment Station in their industrial development program, which is attempting to change Kansas' basic economy from one dependent on farm subsidy to one based on manufacturing employment. In this capacity, he's become known from Elkhart to White Cloud and from Baxter Springs to Burning Privy. And it is certainly one of the high points of my career to have the pleasure of introducing to you Kansas' own native son, patriot, scholar, teacher, and orator, Dwight Alvin Nesmith. Thank you very much. The early 17th century is often called the Age of Invention. It shouldn't be, though. Actually, it's the period from 1810 to 1849 which should be so designated. It was about this time that Chester Plumb was perfecting the plumb line. Galvani, hoping to discover the secret of the doorbell, instead accidentally stumbled on how to galvanize garbage pails. In medicine, great strides were being made. Faraday was laying on the floor unconscious, having just discovered ether. And in Germany, Lager was beginning his experiments with the hops that were to save so many lives. Which brings us to a good place to begin our review of the various engineering fields with some technical chemical engineering. The universe is composed of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Chemical engineering is a study of these elements and combinations of these elements, and out of all the contradictory information about whether to spray or not to spray, in other words, robins versus roaches, 4 equations emerge as important. First, if we mix earth and water, we get mud. When we mix earth and fire, we get gunpowder. When we mix air and water, we get seltzer water, and when we mix fire and water, we get whiskey. While we're on the subject of chemical engineering, the chem engineers and the ag engineers have joined together to attack this food surplus problem. They have developed a remarkable compound called 2,4-D, which kills large trees on contact, blights tomato plants 1.5 miles away, and produces a full-blooming, luxuriant growth in bindweed. While we're speaking of ag products and chem engineering, there's been a great deal of attention paid to this problem of cigarette smoking and lung cancer. You may have read in the paper the other day about this fellow who quit smoking upon reading all these reports. But, of course, there was a habit involved here, and so to replace the habit of smoking, of putting a cigarette in his mouth, he began to chew toothpicks. He just cured it by chewing toothpicks all the time. He died 6 weeks ago of Dutch elm disease. Let's move on to another branch of engineering. One of the worst dilemmas today was created by the agricultural engineers who upset the balance of agriculture, which had been going along fine for years. Farmers were all set, growing the same crops, raising the same livestock, using the same pamphlets in 4-H and HDU meetings as they had in biblical times, until some ag engineer hooked a plow to a Model T Ford. Now, before that, farmers raised horses to pull their plows and their reapers and their wagons, and they raised grain to feed their horses, and they used natural fertilizers to replace the minerals to the ground. But the tractor upset this balance because it didn't use grain, it used petroleum, and so once they got this grain harvested, there wasn't anything to do with it except put it into bins. And once they got all those bin manufacturers going, they kept wanting more and more business, so they invented irrigation pipes so they could grow more grain, so they'd need more bins. There are some people trying to get the government to set up plants to make tractor fuel out of the grain, but we'd just be getting back to where we started. I don't know where it's all going to end, but since the ag engineers started it, we'll let them figure it out. I would like to start my discussion of electrical engineering by pointing out some of the advantages we would have if we didn't have any electricity. Well, first, I feel that it should be quite obvious that if we didn't have any electricity, we wouldn't have any electrical engineers. Another advantage would be that you could stick your finger into a wall socket without getting a shock. And another safety feature would be that car lights wouldn't blind you on the highway at night, which makes it quite dangerous to drive after dark. But enough of this wishful thinking. We have electricity, so we might as well learn about it, but I personally wish that Benjamin Franklin had stuck to selling magazines. Again, a good place to start talking about electricity would be the history of electrical engineering. The first electrical engineers were a Greek named Zeus and a Swede named Odin. They handled a lot of heavy-duty stuff, and they had a lousy safety record. And after them came fellows like Faraday and Ampere and Franklin and Edison and those famous Siamese twins, Westinghouse and General Electric. Now, the best way to think about electricity is to compare it to water. Atmospheric electricity comes out of the clouds during the storm in the form of lightning, and it runs down the hills, into the rivers, out the rivers, into the ocean, where it evaporates again back into the clouds to come down as lightning someplace else and complete the cycle. Now, one way to get a hold of the stuff is to put a power plant on a river which can filter out the electricity and pump it into wires, and then you can send it someplace to be used. Now, since electricity is heavier than water, all you have to do is put it through this big turbine wheel, and the electricity is thrown to the outside by centrifugal force, kind of like in a cream separator. And then you wipe it off with devices called brushes. Now, in some places, the rivers don't have a very rich mixture of electricity, so it's necessary to stockpile a lot of the stuff in order to make it economical, to have a power plant there. But there's lots of politics involved in this, because some people think that this electricity in the water is public property, and so nobody has a right to use it except farmers and Democrats. Now, while we're on the subject of electricity, I might as well explain how television works. In the studio, they stand these people that they want to televise up in front of these big electric lights, and they squirt the electricity out at these people, and it bounces off of them and comes back into this funnel called the camera, and this gets very hot and uncomfortable, and so they either have to pay these people lots of money or use old movies and reruns. Well, anyway, at the transmitter, they pump this electricity up into high towers, and they can squirt it out in all directions. Obviously, the higher the tower is, the more head they have, and the farther they can squirt it. Now, of course, there's another reason to have such high towers. They have to get the red lights up high enough so the airplanes can see them, so they won't run into the towers. Well, then you get this television picture by having a collecting device on your roof, and the electricity kind of runs into it and falls down into that plastic hose down into your set, which explains why television reception is inversely proportional to how good the program is, because if a lot of people have the valves on the set turned on, well, there isn't enough electricity to go around. But if it's a lousy program, there's always plenty. It's beginning to get late, and I wouldn't want you to get the impression that all an engineer has to do is master a bunch of dry technical details like I've been presenting here. An engineer has to have culture, too. Besides being an engineer, and obviously a pretty good one, I am also a father with 5 children, which is pretty good, too. And so my favorite kind of culture is the bedtime story, and I would like to close my discussion then with some examples of this bedtime story art form. Once upon a time there was this king, his beautiful queen, and her little stepdaughter named Sno-White. Now this queen was quite a dish. In fact, you could get odds she was the best-looking doll in those parts. But this was no accident. In fact, it was an out-and-out fix. You see, the queen had this very fancy electronic-type mirror, which was wired for sound, and which had an eye for the female form. And so a couple of times a week, the queen would slip into something filmy and flattering and waltz up to the mirror and say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the slickest chick of all?" And a mirror would reply, "Your gorgeous eyes cause me to shiver. Your ruby lips set me a quiver. You've got a shape that's sheer perfection. It sends me to cast your reflection." But in case some other babe was named Miss Universe, for example, if the mirror says, "The front of you is kind of sagging, and in the back you're kind of dragging," that Susie Schultz that just hit town takes the beauty prize hands down. And then the queen would have poor Susie liquidated and rush out and buy herself a new latex playtex. Well, things went on like this for quite a while, and finally Sno-White grew up, but good. And so one day when the queen consulted her mirror in the closet, "Who's the babe that really has it?" The mirror replied, "Queenie, you are really stacked. So round, so firm, so fully packed. But I ain't had a thrill in a month of Sundays like when I seen Sno-White in her undies." Well, that did it. The Queen calls the Department of Agriculture and tells them to have one of the county farm agents take Sno-White out and plant her. And the poor guy doesn't have much choice being on a federal payroll. So he invites the princess to accompany him on his early morning bird walk. But Sno-White isn't fooled any, and so after a little bit she says, "Excuse me a minute," and ducks behind some bushes and gives him the slip and hides out in his shack in the woods with a bunch of miniature miners who have struck a payload out back of Fort Knox. Well, the hatchet man goes back to the palace, and he tells the Queen that Sno-White is really a gone one, and so she slips into her brand new bikini bathing suit and again consults her mirror. "Now tell me, little looking glass, who's the nation's sweetest lass?" But the mirror replies, "I hate to be the one to spill it, but Sno-White is the one who's still it. That thug told you a pack of lies. She's in the woods with 7 guys." Well, when the Queen hears this, she really blows her stack. She says she knows if she's going to get this job done right, she can't leave it in no government bureau. She's going to have to rub this doll out herself. And so she disguises herself as an old witch and goes out into the woods and doesn't have any trouble finding a place, because when a doll like Sno-White sets up housekeeping in a men's dorm, the word really gets around. The Queen gets into the shack in the woods by claiming she's from the local draft board, and she's checking on a rumor that these miners aren't really midgets, that they cut off their legs to dodge the draft. Well, Sno-White assures her they're really midgets. She says she don't like to seem inhospitable, but she's getting this screaming hangover. Well, the Queen gives her that bit about the hair off a dog that bit you, and pulls out a flask and gives Sno-White a slug with a teacup full of knockout drops for a wash. And then she beats it back to the palace. But when the king sees her coming, disguised as an old witch, he mistakes her for his mother-in-law and decides to play a practical joke on her. So he orders the palace guard to open the drawbridge just as she steps out onto it and dump the old lady in the moat. Now, in the meantime, the man from the REA has come around to the shack in the woods to read the meter. And he finds Sno-White passed out on the floor. Luckily, he is an Eagle Scout, so he gives her artificial respiration. This is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Sno-White tells them miners that she couldn't love them if they had Adler elevator shoes, and so she runs off with this subsidized version of Ready Kilowatt. They go back to the palace to announce their engagement, and before Sno-White can say a word, the mirror speaks right out. "Princess, you're a classy lassie, and how I love that sassy chassis. But I can't bear to see them charms cuddling in someone else's arms. I want you near me every day. I won't let you take him away." Well, sure enough, it turns out that this kilowatt counter takes his socialism pretty seriously, and when he finds out that the princess is a member of the royal family, he takes back his fraternity pin. And the Treasury Department finds out about this shack in the woods when the story breaks in Newsweek. And so they put a sudden halt on this drain on our gold reserves. And then one day, Sno-White catches the magic mirror reciting stereophonic sonnets to the upstairs maid and smashes it to bits. And the last I heard, she was working as a bunny in a Playboy club in St. I want to take this opportunity to present a message. Certainly with the rapid increase of technology that we're having these days, I think it's important that people in all walks of life understand the major things that are taking place, these wonderful scientific and engineering achievements that are going on. We must learn to cope with these things, and so with this in mind, I would like to present a brief review of engineering fundamentals. The stuff that civils need to know doesn't need to be simplified very much for presentation in a short course like we're giving here this evening. It's pretty simple already. They're still building roads and bridges about the same way that the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans did, and the only advanced mathematics they use is that bit about a 3, 4, 5 triangle. However, one change has been forced on them. Since we don't have pharaohs anymore, there isn't much demand for pyramids. But the civils have solved this by most of them joining together in a club called the Corps of Engineers, which goes around erecting huge monuments called dams, which I'm sure are going to be as big a mystery to succeeding generations as the pyramids are to us. Speaking of dams, a major economy was developed in the construction of Tuttle Creek Dam, which is that earth-filled pyramid which was built on the Blue River north of Manhattan in order to control flooding on the Kaw River west of Manhattan. In one area, the base material was too sandy to hold water, so it had to be dug up and replaced with clay from back in the hills. Now, this saved a great deal of money because it gave the trucks a payload going both ways and cut out that wasteful business of a one-way haul empty. Did you ever ask yourselves what is the greatest boon to mankind today? What is the one thing that separates civilized man from uncivilized man? Well, I'll tell you. It's the indoor bathroom. And what is it that makes this so wonderful? Is it the plumbing designed and installed by civil engineers? It's because it's warm. The study of heat in motion is called thermodynamics, and thermodynamics is one of the basic courses for mechanical engineers. I'm sure you all know what steam is. It's that smoke that comes off of hot water. Well, why study about steam? What is it good for? Well, there are lots of things that steam is used for. It's used for pressing pants. It's used for making mashed potatoes and green beans soggy in cafeterias. Well, there isn't as much demand for steam as there used to be because there's lots of things that we used to use steam for that we don't anymore. For example, running locomotives, such as are seen in the fenced enclosures in city parks. When I was a boy, those used to run on tracks, just like diesels. And you used to use steam for running threshing machines before we had combines and soil banks. And we also used to use it pretty regularly for blowing up boilers. It was used to drive the calliope on the merry-go-rounds at carnivals until all the carnivals traded their merry-go-rounds for girly shows. And Sir James Watt, who invented steam, used it to take the lid off a tea kettle. Well, after he solved that tea kettle lid bit, he went to manufacturing light bulbs, but others took up where he left off. Lewis and Clark were made heroes because on their way to Spokane, they drilled a few wildcats in the geysers and invented Yellowstone Park. And Robert Fulton built a boat that ran on steam, and so he could catch more fish than anybody else and start his famous fish market. And a fellow named Stanley something or other even invented a car that ran by steam, but he was legislated out of business by the strong petroleum lobby. And Eli Whitney used steam to make gin from cotton. Steam was used for heating large buildings, but there was a problem because everybody had to keep banging on the pipes in order to get more heat until an ingenious janitor invented a device called water hammer, which can be installed right in the pipes and does all the knocking for you. This device is still used in most steam heating systems today. What you get when you boil water depends primarily on where you get the water. Now, if you take the water from Lake Michigan, you get steam, like we're advertising here. But if you take your water out of the Arkansas River, it is so hard you get mostly rocks. The Arkansas River, by the way, is classified as a navigable stream and is therefore under the control of the federal government. It was 4 years ago that a guy proved it was navigable by riding a motorcycle up the bed from Wichita to Hutchinson. This brings to mind an interesting historical note, which is the fact that the first steam-driven musical instrument was Nero's fiddle, but it developed operational difficulties. And the first agricultural utilization of steam was in a steam-driven milking machine used by a Mrs. O'Leary in Chicago. Both produced rather dramatic results. It's also interesting to note that the two most famous steam engineers of all times were Steamboat Bill and Casey Jones. Both met with early and violent deaths. Let's move on to a discussion of the internal combustion engine. This is a very interesting device. I'm sure you're all familiar with the reflex action, which would cause you to suddenly jerk your finger back if someone was to stick a lighted match on the end of it. This is the principle of operation of the internal combustion engine. You shove this piston up into this tube, and then you set off a gasoline fire right on the end of it, which obviously makes the piston jerk back. And then by a funny kind of an elbow arrangement called a crankshaft, you can change this jerky motion into smooth, surging Dynaflow getaway power. A variation of this principle is used in the jet airplane. Wing Commander Whipple took an old airplane and threw away the engines to make it lighter, and then he lit a fire in the tail, which made it want to get away, which I'm sure you could understand if your pants had ever been on fire. And then by putting kind of a horizontal chimney through the plane to get plenty of draft, they developed aircraft which are attaining tremendous speeds. In fact, they're going so fast now that engineers have begun to worry about the heat barrier, which is where the friction of the air rubbing against the outside of the plane makes the plane get hot all over, but especially in the nose, which obviously defeats the purpose of the fire in the tail. And so the plane won't know which way to go, and so it'll go into a spin or something. While this seems to be a pretty big drawback to high-speed transportation, engineers are not so easily discouraged, and so we have invented the rocket. Rockets go straight up so fast that they leave all that friction heat behind them. However, you always have to watch out for the second law of thermodynamics, which says that in any cyclical process, the absolute entropy of the system will increase. Or, put somewhat more simply, there is no free lunch. Well, sure enough, when the capsules come back down, all that heat they left behind is there waiting for them. And so we have a re-entry problem and heat barriers and heat shields and all that, which Junior Tracy is going to find out if he ever tries to come back from the moon. The achievements of engineers and scientists have been getting quite a bit of publicity in the paper. They've drawn attention even from laymen and politicians and even the literary intellectuals. These literary types are still mad at that statistician who figured out that if you put 1,000 monkeys in a room with 1,000 typewriters and plenty of paper and taught them to strike the keys at random, that eventually these monkeys would produce all the works of Shakespeare. Here they had this Shakespeare worship cult going, and some scientist proves that he was either a very lucky or a well-trained monkey. Well, anyway, they want all this to stop. They still haven't mastered the idea of fire and the wheel yet, and here we are fooling around in space. But I think what they really ought to be worried about is this guy who has started to talk to porpoises. I predict that what he's going to find out is really going to shake them up. Science has claimed for quite a while that whales and porpoises and like that were had better developed brains than humans, were higher on the evolutionary scale. The only reason that they hadn't ruled the world was that they didn't have thumbs, so they couldn't build things or write. Well, this guy has started talking to porpoises, and he has discovered that he can understand what they say if he records it and plays it back real slow. In other words, those dumb fish have been talking so fast we couldn't understand them. I can just see some porpoise who has escaped from marine land going back into the ocean and telling a story like Mowgli the Wolf Boy. I was raised among the humans. Maybe those porpoises came to marine land as missionaries in the first place. You see, it's never been proven to my satisfaction whether the trainers had taught the porpoises to jump for fish or whether the porpoises have taught the trainers to throw fish. I've been listening for somebody to say, "Daddy, tell me another." I didn't hear it, but I've never told one bedtime story in my life. And so I'm going to tell you another one anyway. Once upon a time there was this king and a queen, and they had this little baby daughter, which was perfectly all right because they had been married for years. And since they had a lot of servants to get up and give her a 3 o'clock bottle and rinse out her dirty diapers, they loved her very much. And so on her first birthday, they decided to throw this big birthday party. Now, it seems in those days that wizards and sorceresses and fairies and like that were very influential in the government. But the guest list was getting out of hand, and so the king put his foot down, and he said that 12 fairies at a birthday party was plenty. And so one of the biggest fairies in the kingdom got left off the guest list. Well, when it came time to open up presents, why, the regular people gave the baby princess things like teething rings and war bonds, but the wizards and sorceresses and fairies, instead of giving her stuff come from the department store, they gave her mostly good wishes and magic spells. For example, one of them gets up and says, your beauty will be something special. Be sure to preserve it with a Palmolive facial. And another one gets up and says, of ill health you'll have your share, but I grant you coverage under Medicare. And another one says, your formal gowns will be nicely filled with a 3 dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen build. And another one hands her this beautifully bound book and says, this book is a surefire moneymaker called Playing the Market by Bobby Baker. And another one says, my gift is towels that belong to Liz, marked hers and his and his and his. But just as the last one is getting up to grant her wish, why, the 13th fairy busts into the room with an evil laugh. She is all dressed in black except for this necklace, which is a silver medallion commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Department of Agriculture, with a picture of Orville on one side and Billy Saul on the other. And it's hanging from this chain around her neck, and she looks them all right straight in the eye, which is kind of hard to do with a room full of people. And as this medallion sways back and forth, she chants, she'll never live to be happily wed. On her 16th birthday, you'll all drop dead. How this will happen is a simple question. I just made a post-hypnotic suggestion. And then she runs out of the room, still laughing. But the 12th fairy stands up and says, since I haven't spoken, you have a chance. You won't be dead, but in a trance. For 100 years you'll stay like this till the spell is broken by a prince's kiss. Well, this evil spell story creates quite a furor at first, but I have about it except in jokes by sick comedians and in campaign promises, but nobody does anything about it. And the princess grows up to be quite a doll, just like them good fairies have said. And she's rich, too, because the king has built up kind of a nice nest egg, got a kickbacks from insurance policies. But as the prince's 16th birthday approaches, why, the king and the queen are a little bit nervous about this evil spell story, and so instead of throwing a big birthday party, why, they decide just to have a family get-together. Well, after the princess opens her presents, which include a new hi-fi set from an anonymous donor, she goes upstairs to get her hair fixed, and the rest of them sit down and watch this old Shirley Temple movie on the TV. Meanwhile, upstairs, this old lady is fixing the prince's hair, and the princess is fascinated by her necklace, which is this old medallion hanging from a chain around her neck. And as the old lady combs, why, the medallion sways back and forth, and pretty soon the princess twitches a couple of times and rolls her eyeballs up so she looks like Orphan Annie. And passes out on a bed. And at the same instant, everybody else in the castle, they twitch a couple of times and roll their eyeballs up and pass out too. And everything around the place goes into this dormant state, except the Bermuda grass, and it keeps right on growing. And pretty soon it covers all the doors and all the windows and covers up the castle. Well, at first the League of Women Voters make some half-hearted attempts to find out what happened to the government. But since the king and the whole royal family is passed out up in the castle, there isn't anybody to lead a real rescue attempt, and so the country is left without a ruler. And you can imagine how fast things begin to go to pot. There ain't any king to run the railroads. There ain't any queen to run the television stations. People start walking on the grass in front of the post office. And kids start praying in public schools. And not only that, without any ruler, the people who are smart and who work hard keep getting rich. And the people who are dumb and lazy keep getting poor. It's a hell of a mess. Well, the royal family might have been there yet, except the 100th winter was an especially severe one, and all the Bermuda grass got winter killed. And one day that spring, this unemployed prince happens by in his Harley, and he flicks a lighted cigarette butt into this great big pile of dry grass and old newspapers. Have you ever stopped to figure out how many daily newspapers would be on a lawn after 100 years? It's a good thing those old castles were made mostly out of rocks, so it gets pretty badly scorched on the outside, but it don't burn down or nothing. And after the fire dies down, the prince decides to take a look around inside, and so he kicks the door down, and he goes in and finds all these people sitting around watching an old Shirley Temple movie on the TV. And he tries to strike up a conversation with this old guy who was sitting there with his eyeballs rolled up, looking like Daddy Warbucks. But he doesn't get any answer. And then he remembers this legend about this dolly who's been sitting around 100 years waiting to be kissed. And so he starts right out to look for her, and when he finds her, he begins right in to give her this Hollywood version of mouth-to-mouth artificial respiration. Well, the princess comes out of her trance to find this perfect stranger fogging up her contact lenses. Well, maybe he wasn't perfect, but after 100 years, he looked pretty good to the princess. So she don't let on that she's awake. And after a while, the prince figures out maybe it's going to take more than just a kiss to wake her up. But the princess isn't having any of that. And so she opens her eyes and says, "Thanks just the same. I'm sure there ain't any bones broken. Let's go meet my folks." Well, the hairdresser is awake, and downstairs everybody else is awake too, and man, you never seen such a rush for the bathroom. Well, after the confusion dies down, the princess introduces her new boyfriend, and right away the queen wants to know how long they've been awake up there in the room. And so they have this big wedding, and they have a big reception afterwards, and Guy Lombardo plays for the wedding ball because he's always been the queen's favorite. And after the wedding, the princess sells her story to Life magazine and does a bunch of TV commercials on how I slept 100 years on a beauty rest mattress and didn't get no bed sores or nothing. And they live happily ever after, except there's one big question left in everybody's mind about this magic awakening, and that is, did she or didn't she? But only her hairdresser knows for sure.